Welcome everyone to the Tata-Cornell Institute special event on the Food, Agriculture and Nutrition Report for South Asia. Great pleasure to have all of you here, and we've got a bunch of people on Zoom. I can't tell how many at the moment. The Food, Agriculture and Nutrition Report has a long history. We're a 10-year-old institute, so for us, anything over 2 years is long. And so our first fan report, as we call it, was released in 2020, and that looked at food, agriculture, and nutrition situation in India, and a very comprehensive assessment of why India continues to have such high levels of malnutrition. What's the role of agriculture and food in addressing this problem, and what are the big policy and technology interventions that are necessary? And that report had a lot of uptake within the government in India. There are a lot of policy discussions that came out of that, and it's a very strong reference volume now. So following on that, we decided to do a much more deep dive report, which was a fan for Bihar, the state of Bihar, which is the poorest state, one of the poorest states in India, and presented that report in 2022. Also having a good impact in the state of Bihar and providing Bihar with a plan on how to look ahead in terms of addressing hunger and malnutrition. Then we decided to become a bit more ambitious. Said, let's look across the region. Let's look across South Asia and come up with a report similar to the India report, but for the whole region. And I think it's important to look at the region as a whole, because South Asia, in many ways, is facing very similar problems. And learning from each other is very useful within the country, within the region. And so we decided to really leap forward and bring together our assessment of everything from Pakistan, India, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, etc., all countries together. And I must congratulate the team that put this together. Isha is the main author, and you'll be hearing from him soon. He spent over a year working on this, right? And there was a group of people who contributed quite significantly to the report. We'll be launching that here today, but we hope to also do some launches in South Asia itself, possibly do a big launch in Bangladesh at some point. And then, of course, also in India. People always say, so why are you guys looking at South Asia? You're a very strong India program. And one of the reasons is, over the last 10 years, we've learned a lot about food, agriculture, and nutrition in India. And our model of evidence-based research and supporting PhD student research, supporting postdoc research, I think is a model that's transferable across the region. And so by bringing out such reports, we can also be announcing that we're open to spreading our work beyond India and looking at opportunities to bring in our neighbors in South Asia to be associated with our program. And the shape that will take is something we'll have to see as we go over the next year or two, but that's certainly the vision that we have looking ahead. With that, let me get on to the program. So we'll start with an introduction of the report given by Milorad Plavsic, we call him Misha for short. He's the main author and he'll make a presentation. And then we have a very dynamic panel, an interdisciplinary panel here. Andrew McDonald, Associate Professor in Plant Science and Soil Science. Andrew has spent over a decade in Nepal, and he knows more about South Asia and particularly Eastern India, Bihar, etc., than most people. And I've traveled with Andrew, and he knows everybody in the region. So I'm very glad to have Andrew here. Arnab Basu, a professor from the Dyson School of Applied Economics. Strong development economist who knows the region and will be commenting from an economic perspective. And Ramya Ambikapathi, who is a nutritionist working in global development. And again, someone who's coming with very strong credentials on food and nutrition issues. And she'll be bringing that perspective to the panel. So after Misha speaks, then I'll have each of the panelists say a few words, and then we'll have an open discussion. And then possibly have some time for a glass of wine after that. All right, Misha, on to you.
You can just use the podium. Well, thank you, Prabhu, for this kind introduction. And I would like to thank everybody who came here today to this room. And I would also like to thank everybody who are watching us over Zoom and who I hope will also contribute to discussion after the presentations. I would start with thanking the TCI team, first of all, who was really crucial to help with this creation of this report, but also people outside of TCI, friends of the TCI, outside of Cornell, who helped with their very constructive comments on how to shape the report, what to include, what not to include, and I'm really grateful for that help. The aim of this presentation will be to give an overview of the report. So the report is quite dense and quite concentrated. There are a lot of data, a lot of graphs, comments. I try to connect different parts of food systems in the report and to make it relatively understandable to a broad audience. So I will not be able to go too deep into each of the sections of this report. So this will be a snapshot. And in the report is on food systems. And then as we in this room know, it's a very complex system, and there are a lot of elements. Each element is very interesting, and the interaction between elements is also very interesting. And then sometimes it was challenging to decide how deep to go. And then to decide how deep to go, I just followed my instinct and the feedback from my colleagues, basically. So I worked for a government institution. I was a student, master student, PhD student. Now I'm more into project world, and I try to imagine what would it be for me to be useful to read in such reports. And that is what drew me, what to include, what not to include, and then how deep to go. I hope that we will all have at some point time to go through the report and see what's in there. Now, who is the report for? So I won't go like specific group by group, like NGOs, researchers, government people, professors, etc. But I would be more like descriptive. So the report is for those who want to learn more about specific elements of the food systems in South Asian countries, be it agriculture productivity or number of tractors per hectare or calories eaten or consumption patterns or, anemia, prevalence of anemia. So people who are interested in specific elements within food systems, but also people who would want to look into food systems as a bigger picture and to see how these elements are connected, how they communicate. Also, for those who are looking at a good research question, for students who are still trying to figure out which direction they want to go, this report might be helpful. And also for those who would just like to know more about South Asia as a region. What's in the report? So I would say there are three broad sectors, so to speak. So on one hand, I collected a lot of data from different publications, from different sources, which are scattered around, and sometimes it's not easy to find those data. So I try to save some time to people who will be looking into these issues in South Asia. The second one is we also created some data and some maps which are not available elsewhere, so it's informative in that sense. And also there is a set of policy recommendations, and we'll get back to that later. So it's not only a dry set of recommendations, what to be done and what not to be done, because it's very context specific, but when one is doing policy exercise, how to approach that policy exercise. So let's talk about some graphs that I really found interesting and really that drew my attention. So on the left-hand side here, you can see a graph about prevalence of undernourished and overweight in South Asia. So this graph is not a big surprise to many people. So that number of undernourished went down, and then many things happen. A lot of very different factors. The numbers going up. At the same time, we have this trend of prevalence of overweight is going up. Now, and this is 2016, and now the question is why it is, I at least personally found it relatively difficult to find information what happened after 2016. I even wrote to WHO to ask them what's happening. And eventually I found only one source. I mean, you probably know more about this. It's NCD portal where you can find some numbers on, but if you look at the FAO stat, if you look at the food system dashboard, if you look at the WHO health observatory, it's really not that easy to find these numbers. And now the question is, so why it is not easy? If we know that obesity and overweight is going up, if we know that it is going to be one of major challenges, then why it is so difficult to find that information online? And that is the reason why I put this graph. The second reason is that in South Asian countries, you have different policies to address hunger, to reduce number of hungry people. And yet, even with all these policies in place, as we can see, there is a number of undernourished people going up recently. And then I just wonder, so if countries are struggling even to reduce this number even more, then how in the future the same countries will be capable to address both obesity and undernourishment, if only one challenge was already big enough for them? The second graph that I chose is like vitamin A deficiency and supplementation coverage in South Asia. And why did I choose that one? So I chose that one because it might be intuitive to think if the rate of vitamin supplementation is high, the deficiency will be low. And this is where we see in some countries. So in Bangladesh, for example, so the orange one or red one is quite high. This is supplementation. And then the number of prevalence of deficiency is quite low. But then in some countries, such as Afghanistan, they have almost 100% supplementation rate, yet vitamin A deficiency is also very high. So something doesn't add up here. So either the data is incorrect or the supplementation is not being implemented properly, or something just doesn't add up. And that caught my attention. Again, I'm not trying to explain what happened. I don't know. I'm just giving this question to all of you. In addition to that, in the report, I'm also looking at different trends when it comes to consumption, when it comes to nutritional outcomes. So one of the trends I looked into is urbanization. Urbanization. It's a global phenomenon. As we'll see in between 1916 and 2017, on a global level, urbanization rate went up from 35 to 55%. But if we look into South Asian countries, then the picture is very diverse. So some countries, such as Sri Lanka, urbanization rate almost hasn't changed at all in a 60-year time. In other countries, such as Bhutan, it went up from 4 to 40%. So Bhutan, Maldives, and Pakistan, in this graph, they have the highest urbanization rate in South Asian countries. Coincidentally, if you look at adult overweight rates, you see Bhutan, Maldives, Pakistan having the highest overweight rates. Now, these rates depend on many factors. It's not only urbanization, of course. There's a complex set of interactions which lead to, but I just find, again, looking into these graphs, very interesting, intriguing, and I think I would be happy to myself to spend more time trying to find the correlation, see how come in some countries, even though the slope is almost the same, that how rapid the urbanization rate, whether that affected these overweight rate or not. So it again remains to be seen. This is a slide that I was hoping that can bring, nutritionists and agronomists together, maybe those who are interested in market linkages. So what do we hear? Let's start with the map. So these are cropping patterns in South Asia. The purple color that sorry, this is not purple, this is dark red. I'm not really good with color, as you can notice. So this is Afghanistan, heavily dominated by wheat production, cereals. In Bangladesh, you can see the same. So very dominated by cereals. This is rice in this case. But then in India, you can see all sorts of different crops. In the report, you can see what kind of crops those are. And I don't want to go into details during this presentation. What I wanted to just comment on, you see that in Afghanistan, Bangladesh, very dominated by cereals. If you look at the diet, so this is diet, calories per capita per day per person. In Afghanistan and Bangladesh, pretty monotonous diets, cereals dominated diets. If you look at India, then you can see much diverse diets. Just in the case of urbanization and obesity, there's so many different drivers of what people eat. It's about market linkages, it's about income, it's about what you produce, it's about where you produce. But again, just a snapshot, looking into these two figures, cropping patterns and what people eat might give you some hint why people eat what they eat. This is another one I found very interesting figure that you can also find in the report. And it is where the agriculture value is coming from. Is it from cereal production? Is it from livestock? Or is it from vegetable production? As you can see in literally all countries in South Asia, value coming from cereal, this is yellow, is going down, and value coming from livestock and fruit and vegetables is going up. So we are witnessing transformation within agriculture production. Now, there are a lot of potential follow-up questions. What is happening with the households who move from cereals to, let's say, fruits and vegetables? Who is the major layer? Is it male? Is it female? So what is going on with nutrition if you shift from cereals to livestock? A more of animal consumption of animal products, and all sorts of, and there is a whole list of questions that came up in my mind when I looked at this graph. Is quite simple, but tells a lot, I think. We also cover animal production in South Asia, and here you can see where is the highest concentration of different animals. So on the top, you can see cattle distribution in South Asia. Then buffalo, chicken, sheep here, and goat here. And then what I found interesting, when we're looking into Pakistan, for example, you can see very concentrated animal production in pretty much when it comes to all animals, and it's pretty much Punjab and Sindh region. In other countries, it's very different. But then For example, sheep distribution. You can see some areas in India very concentrated, in other areas less so. Bangladesh is always, I find a fascinating country to analyze agriculture, because you look at the chicken, it's everywhere, and then you look at some other animals, you can barely see. So obviously there are a lot of reasons why people produce what they produce. I was just thinking, putting all these maps together, it tells a very powerful story. Then lately, the TCI started working a lot on impact of climate to agriculture on climate, measuring greenhouse gas emissions. What is the appropriate way? Andy has, I'm sure, a lot to share with us if he wants. We learn a lot from him. I learn a lot while working on this project, but also on this report, but also in the project. But again, what I wanted to say by showing these two graphs, I'm using the same data set. So emissions are exactly the same, but what is different is angle, how you look at it. On the left-hand side, you can see emissions per capita. On the right-hand side, you can see emissions per hectare of agricultural land, because we're talking at the end of the day about agriculture emissions. Now, if we look at these two graphs, what do we see? In the example of Afghanistan, for example, here in the emission per capita, it's relatively, like not average, but relatively. But if you look at the agricultural land, you cannot see it. On the other hand, in Bangladesh, if you look per capita, it's again relatively high, but not super high. If you look here, Bangladesh is almost off the chart. So what I'm trying to say, different people, different, if you say policymakers might want to promote different angle, depends on what works for them better, right? If you wanna compete who pollutes less or more, then you can just choose, and both are using the same numbers. I was just trying to show that how different angle can tell a completely different story. Finally, the last part of the report, there is a policy section. Again, why I think this is important, not because of subsidies for high yield varieties, or it's very well-known. It's nothing new about it. What I wanted to say is that when one is thinking about introducing a policy instrument, one should think not only about the direct impact, how that is going to, for example, affect that yield, but there are different, let's say, angles that or aspects you want to take into consideration. One is economic one. So is it accessibility? Is it accessible to small-scale farmers or only large farmers? Who is it for? Environment. What are environmental impacts of introducing a certain variety or breed or a new technology? Health. Again, what does it have? Are there any health consequences that one can expect after introducing a certain new variety? And this is just a snap. This is only one example. We have like 50 examples across the whole supply chain. Social, is that variety or breed, is it appropriate? Is it acceptable to local people? So all these things should be taken into consideration when proposing a policy instrument. And I'm not sure that right now these all things are taken into consideration. I have one more slide, the last one. It's about the key messages, and I hope that these key messages will also inspire our panelists later. So the first one is beware of unintended consequences. When I talk about that, I talk about negative externalities. So having a policy instruments that achieve exactly what it was supposed to achieve in that sense, but also causing some negative externalities in different areas. Sometimes it's very difficult to identify those negative externalities, or even more difficult to quantify them. That's also true. Sometimes there are competing interests, let's say, between two departments, agriculture department, environment department. What do we do then? The second one is, what are the ingredients for successful policies? So there are many ingredients, but I just named a few there. So one is knowledge and understanding. So there are a lot of direct and underlying determinants of different changes and trends in food systems. So should one look into direct or underlying or both, and how they interact between themselves? credible and timely data. I really don't think we should need to spend a lot of time explaining why this is crucial. Without good data, it's difficult to have good policy proposals. Institutional infrastructure is another issue. So how to assess what is the capacity of certain institutions to create and also implement a certain policy intervention. And finally, political will. Without the political will, it's very difficult to do that. That's the reality, I believe. And the final one is that tackling food systems issues requires collaboration. Collaboration, horizontal or vertical collaboration between countries. So what do we do when two countries are not really getting along very well? And in South Asia, we have a couple of examples, right? And that's it. So what do we do then? Because a lot of, especially environmental challenges, they don't know borders. I mean, when there is a pollution in one region, there is a pollution in a region, irrespective of which side of the border it is. So how do we do it? How do we make those countries acknowledging that cooperation will be, let's say, more beneficial than not cooperation? That's again, I don't have an answer to that. So I'm just giving you some of the questions. When you have a very skewed power dynamics between countries or between institutions, how do you deal with that? How do you do when you have something who's very powerful and who can dictate conditions and promoting own interests and ignoring the interests of those who are neglected? How to do that for marginals? How to, again, I don't have an answer to that question, but these are the key messages. What I understand is that we should find a way. Now, how to find a way, that's another issue. And with that, I will just finish this presentation. I hope I didn't go over. And again, I would like to thank everybody who came here and everybody who helped me to create this report. Thank you very much. Maybe you want to go first?
Sure.
Now it's too late to say no, right?
Send questions up there, they can keep it to late. Well,
I just want to say that this is a really fantastic report, so congratulations to Misha and the team. I'm proud of his leadership to pull this together. I mean, we need more of these kinds of synthesis documents that really pull together a lot of evidence and help us think through how to understand pretty complicated issues. Can you hear me? Yeah. Sorry, just use that. Yeah.
you're
Okay.
on Zoom, so.
Okay, so can you hear me in the back? So 10 minutes, 8 countries, not possible. So I'm going to pull some examples from some of our work in India and really kind of respond to some of the comments that ended up in the executive summary. So I could talk about these things for the next 2 hours. I promise not to. I'll go quickly, and then of course maybe we'll have some time to follow up on some points that Misha had made and that the panel reinforces. But in this executive summary, I really like this. All necessary ingredients are required to support change. Right? This isn't one innovation or one policy. This is thinking about systems. And so I'm not going to read out what's in the executive summary, but systems analysis, essential data, and impact-oriented collaborations. And I think these pieces are all mutually reinforcing. This collaboration has to be infused with a shared understanding. And that a lot of times comes down to essential data. So I'll return to that comment at the end. So if we think about what makes India unique, again, a lot of what I'm going to say is just related to India, but there's commonalities elsewhere in South Asia. We have a lot of assets to acknowledge and think about that are positioning systems in India to really crack and deliver against multiple sustainable development goals, but we also have liabilities. So on the good side, we've got massive investments now in Odisha. The State Department of Agriculture invests more than $1 billion a year in ag development. That's in a single year. We've got science capabilities down to the district level. We've got a lot of private sector investment in value chains and digital ag and the like. There's a host of liabilities though. Lack of role clarity between institutions, poor coordination among organizations, almost no M&E beyond saying what things have kind of gone out the door. We've got overly simplified understandings of what farmers are doing. We think about stylized farmers and not distributions of practices and socioeconomic factors. We've got investments in a lot of environmental information, but we don't know how farmers are managing their farms. So assets and liabilities. In my, so the basic premise here is, in my program, is saying, can bigger data unlock the potential of South Asian agriculture and Indian agriculture in particular to accelerate sustainability transitions in agriculture? We've done this in India through something that we call the LCAS approach, the Landscape Crop Assessment Survey approach. This is done with ICAR in India. I won't go through this now, but this is getting an understanding about what's going on in spatially explicit sampling with a spatially explicit sampling framework across big areas in India. Across South Asia, we've also done this in Nepal and Bangladesh. We have about 50,000 fields that have been surveyed over the last 5-year period. Why does this matter? You think Misha asked me to comment a little bit on production practices and also the link to greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm just going to have a few comments on the fertilizer piece, the nitrogen fertilizer piece, and some concluding remarks on methane. This is an analysis that we've done across 6 different areas, actually, of the totality of Bangladesh, Nepal, and a few different states in India. This is nitrogen rate by crop response. Right? So this is a lot of data, and this is looking at distributions of those relationships. And without paying too much attention to what you see, you recognize that the pattern across all these different areas is remarkably different. But there's also a tremendous amount of variation within most of these places as well. Not so much in Punjab and Haryana, but look at Bihar and Eastern UP. You've got a lot of farmers that are doing comparatively well with efficiency and yield. You have others that are performing pretty poorly, right? So this is the reality that we have to grapple with when we're thinking about production processes and environmental outcomes associated with things like nitrogen management. And if you further look into that kind of data, there are pretty big, maybe unexpected patterns that emerge. So this is estimated global warming potential associated with nitrogen management in rice-based systems in the eastern part of India. And this is how this falls out according to yield class. We have in mind that farmers that are chasing the yield frontier are creating the most environmental externalities. But when you're held accountable to data, that logic is actually reversed. And it's actually, in these data, the lower yielding farmers that are contributing most of the problem. Right? So this has pretty big implications for policies and how you might approach the problem. So the upshot is some farmers use too much nitrogen. It's probably not the ones that the policymakers are thinking are causing the problem. The other advantage of having this kind of data and a spatially explicit framework is that we can start developing predictive models. So this is we develop a machine learning based model and then ask the model policy what if questions. So if farmers change practice, in this case, there's a 2019 policy that suggests from the Modi government that all farmers should reduce nitrogen use by 25%. It's a national goal. If you pump that through the model, there's going to be winners and losers, unsurprisingly, right? You know, some farmers you don't actually want to reduce nitrogen fertilizer. If we have these kind of data and couple that with predictive models, we can see how this falls out spatially, which of course has pretty strong relevance to policy. And if we use, in turn, those data also to have better farmer-facing tools to guide management at the field level, we can do much better in terms of multiple development outcomes. I'm not going to go into the details here, but if you use an analytics-based nitrogen recommendation for wheat in the Eastern EGP, you can save about $28 million a year in subsidy costs without compromising any yield potential. If you use the soil health card, which is just based on soils criteria, and actually increase nitrogen use with no gain in yield, right? So having these kinds of data also permits us to do different things with farmer-facing management recommendations. Okay, I'm not sure how I'm doing on time. I think I have 2 more. Am I okay? All right. So we're also not collecting the right kind of data everywhere. And Misha has seen this set up too many times, but this relates to the methane work that we started through Zero Hunger, Zero Carbon and aligned initiatives in Eastern India. What I'm showing here is a single production season On the rows on the left, they're represented on the left, represent individual production fields in a single district in India. And the heat map, you can think about it as just the flood and the recession. If the cell is red, it means that there's no standing water in that rice field. If it's blue, it means that there's standing water. And what you can see is even in one district in a single season, there's just a tremendous amount of heterogeneity in the hydrology. And this is not governed by only by irrigation practice. This is moisture routing, this is shallow groundwater, this is landscape controls, in addition to management. And we have no information about this in big areas. And if you know anything about how methane is generated in ag systems, this rules the roost. If you don't know your baselines and the distributions that characterize the hydrology, the game is off, right? So there's types of data that we need to acquire, and we need to think about clever ways of getting this at scale and recurrently collected. All right, home stretch. When I think about policy reform, I also think about processes as well, right? Collectively, we're doing all this interesting stuff, whether it's ex-ante work, or priority setting, or context-dependent R&D and innovation, but it's not adding up because there's too many bifurcations between organizations, and we don't have a shared reality that's linked back to data systems, right? So if we start investing more heavily in integrated data systems, and we're collecting the right kind of data at the right temporal and spatial scale, and we do more to link these different components of the innovation system in a more deliberate way. So it's not ad hoc collaboration, but it's planned collaboration, and the policy instruments in place to reinforce the institutional arrangements to make this happen, then I think really good things can happen. But last thing I'll say is that in the domain of climate change, we're not thinking about a transition towards sustainable futures. We're thinking about continuing transitions to sustainable futures. So the policy reform, in my view, has to go across these kinds of cycles and encourage the kinds of inter-institutional arrangements to make this happen on a recurrent basis. And so with that, I hope I didn't go over, and thank you.
So Misha already asked me for input on this report a year ago. I gave them input, and it's kind of nice to see you address a lot of my comments. Thank you, and it's also nice to see a finished product. I'm just going to give you my high-level comments, what I really liked, what was sort of interesting, and where do you go next. So whenever I read reports, the first thing I look at is for pictures. It's just, it's very powerful, the images and how it was selected and what image you're trying to say. And I really appreciated men eating food. Men and nutrition is not something that you commonly see. So I like that photo. Same thing what Andy was saying. I liked there's no silver bullet. This report is intended for debate. So what I really liked is that it's really good descriptive data altogether, and the framing and the storytelling. Similar to what Andy was saying, there's a lot of analysis, like you put take out, and it's like and it's like there's not enough like thinking through why is this pattern we're seeing. So I really appreciated the storytelling as well as the data. So I'll just a few things that I noticed. The One Nutrition. It's interesting. It's like sort of the One Health approach, alignment of activities. There was a key theme. There was a theme about climate change, but I also think, shocks are that we should just expect shocks, and there's also non-climate change shocks. Work together across disciplines for food system puzzles. That was very much noted. And then implication of methods. I really appreciate there was a strong need kind of explaining why some of these are purely because of the methods we use. And then as I mentioned, I thought some of the photos were very powerful. So this struck me because this is a report of asking questions. I'm also in the way of asking questions. Wasting, very where like you see the sort of stunting and underweight sort of has this pattern, really high in the poorest, really low, like sort of this curve as you would expect, but wasting doesn't. Do we know why? I think there's a spatial aspect to it. There's a lot of and measurement. I think it's because when you look at wasting as a total, I don't know if they do the quintiles by urban versus rural areas, if they're combining. So when they do the assets, some of the peri-urban poorer people are actually might be in the richer, where you see a lot more wasting. So, but I'm actually curious. I would love to see why we have this sort of wasting pattern that are even in the richest quintile. Outliers. I was struck by Sri Lanka. The egg production. I don't know if it was noticed. I was very much struck by that. And also similarly, Sri Lanka does have a lower stunting, wasting, and underweight. And I'm not sure, even in like by 1960, it's quite high. Like chicken production was quite even higher than India, which was a bit of a surprise. So I don't know if it's like real data. Do you trust this data? Do you trust this data? I don't know anyone who works in Sri Lanka. Is this real? But I mean, it's so nutrition people, they have like favorites. I'm actually not team. Eggs were a big thing. I'm not a team eggs. I'm more team legumes. But I was struck by the egg production in Sri Lanka and what we're seeing in terms of stunting, wasting, and underweight. Okay. So this was interesting. Again, nice patterns. You see the anemia coming back, and anemia tends to be higher among women of reproductive. It's actually really high among adolescent boys. We just don't measure them actually, and women of reproductive age. I don't know if I've ever seen the role of demography playing up, like, the shift in demography is leading to this increase. So I just kind of looked at ages, the median age of the population, Sri Lanka being 34, and then like lower, Pakistan having 22 years. So I think that's something like even in the consumption practices, like what are 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds consuming versus like what do people consume in your 40 or 50? So kind of looking at like, are these really related to like policies not working, or is it really due, like if we could kind of attribute some of those effects, that would be interesting. Because you do see this sort of, or it could be a method, who knows? But I do think we should be looking close to how demographic transition plays a role in these estimates. Nutrition transition. Nutrition transition is purely it's like it started when women working outside. And I like this quote as well because it's talking about how women, the younger women, they prefer the like one place, it's convenient, they get everything done. Or they shopping in supermarkets is more time consuming than traditional markets. So it's kind of interesting how these preferences come through. But I mean, the whole nutrition transition started is when women started working outside home, and then the industries were paying attention to this. When industries would have, they would have these focus group discussions with women and asking what products, what can you. So clearly, the industries are listening to women. I don't know if as a research community, I don't know if we're doing enough talking to women, but I do think women's overall employment will play a big role in that. And time is also a reoccurring thing that I saw throughout this. Okay, and as I said before, I really liked men's role. We all eat, men eat too, right? Everybody eats in their own diets for the household diet. And I like this particular quote that I just wanted to highlight from the report and the photo. I recently presented something for climate change in the US context, but it's also true. I haven't seen any data because we don't have data. I haven't seen diet data on men in India or South Asia for that matters. And there's also all these issues of recall bias that needs to go. But here, this is in the US. This is from NHANES data. And this is looking at emissions of, and you look at the highest impact, all male, different kinds of male. So, when you talk about planetary health, sustainable health, healthy diet, or one nutrition, it's always The specificity of who the target should be is really interesting because it's high-income urban men who needs to be targeted. And then when you think about poor men, men overall actually have a poor diet quality compared to women, which is also something that's not being recognized because there's a, if you're thinking about inclusive healthy diets for all, whatever it is, you need to think about men and see what they're eating. And this is something I present, like these metrics, the cost of healthy diet metrics, all of these things that are coming out, those are cost of healthy diet in the food environment. There's tremendous amount of meal planning, there's processing, cleaning, and it all takes time and effort and fuel and water. Like you don't get to healthy diet consumption just from like what's in the food environment. So once you account for women's time, all of this stuff, and even in the time use surveys, even in the US, you still see women spending almost twice as much, like 60 to 75 minutes compared to men who spend 25 minutes for meal prep and stuff. So if you account for all of this, the true cost of food, I mean, it should be very gender, but it's also like, it's all these like unpaid things that are happening in the back. That's the indirect things that we are not quite don't have the instruments to measure. So I do like that you focused a bit on food consumption methodology. I think methods is going to be something very important, especially as like all these shifts are happening. We need new methods, and what new methods, but also like transitions. People are moving the rural food environments, urban food environments, peri-urban food environments. So there's a lot of transition that's happening, which means there's more investments in not just type of data, but also methods related data as well. And then a bit more forward-looking, short-term solutions are meant to be short-term. There was a lot of political economy theme, which I liked, was nice, and it's a social, but also basic and social determinants of ag labor and fair, decent living. What is that? Decent jobs. What does that mean? How does one get it? And it tends to be also a bit gendered. I think for me, working in the space for the last 4 or 5 years, one thing that's very clear to me is that food system is also a social system. It's an economic system, but it's also incredibly you think about it in terms of small, medium, the SMEs, how they contract. It's purely through social contracts. It's informal, but I mean, again, in general, like the vendor relationship, the trust, the food safety, all of that is depending on the social relationship. And also to realize foods, the way we consume them, are also affected by non-food system factors like housing plays a big role in what kind of food we consume. And then investments in high resolution surveillance, but there's always data. I don't know. I have this. But India has a lot of data. It's sitting in someone's office in rural development, it's just accumulating dust. Someone has to go sit and have like chai for 10 days, and maybe they'll get a little bit of the data. So just making it available. It's there. It's just kind of making it available. But is it equitable? Who's using it? Like last week, I was at the Global Food Security Conference, and I was having a conversation with Arnab Basu, who was talking about the TAFSA project releasing data for the first time, as even before they publish it, which was pretty remarkable. But then, who's actually using it? It's PhD students, probably from high-income Ivy League institutions. So what that tells me is that this sort of collaboration, sort of participatory, has to start from the training up. It can't just be, at this end, at the policymaker end, but it's also, and that's related to capacity building. And then there's this sort of movement towards capacity sharing that I've seen recently. And then shocks are part of life, as we all know. We should just expect it to happen. And then the last thing about the paradigm shift, working and collaborations. We see these things in South Asia, but these tensions exist here, right? In Cornell, in like the kind of programs we have. So you can't show up for like all the things that are outgoing there, but not show up here in our workplaces, in our homes. So I do think that sort of participatory recognition of inequities, recognition of like agenda setting, priority setting, that's also starts here. And then because you're trying to enable systems, not just for the food system challenges today, but whatever challenges in the future, there's a system in place that could really mitigate those shocks. So that paradigm shift has to start at home, I think. So. And then that's it. This is my favorite quote. I always think there's two kinds of nutrition, which is the pre-swallowing world, which is where I am, because it's like geography, it's economics, it's sociology, it's experience, it's anthropology. It's really a melting of disciplines. That's the world I belong in. And then there's the biology, physiology, all the, I don't know, precision nutrition stuff. So all the other stuff that comes post swallowing. So this to me is how I conceptualize nutrition. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Unfortunately, I don't have a deck of slides. My thoughts are, as you can imagine, pretty disorganized. But I will try to, follow some structure. The first thing I want to really talk about is how good the report is. It was really a revelation. You have a broad development economics with a lot of interest in labor, trade, a bit of agriculture, and all kinds of stuff, but comparative studies are rare. So it's very nice to see a comparative study that touches upon a lot of very interesting components related to nutrition. So I'm going to look carefully into my quotes and lay some of these out. So some of the very interesting things are the consumption patterns across the South Asian countries that I found very interesting to read. The obesity numbers and the micronutrient deficiency, what kind of supplementations. It was very, very deep. It's one thing to do one country at a time, but it's a whole different world when you're looking at comparatively at all these countries. Some of the things that I actually loved in the report was highlighting some potential issues. Some are really, really quite important. For instance, the measurement issue. Misha didn't talk about this in the 12 slides you had, but just composing the global diversity index and aggregating from the individual to the household and then economic-wide is a very challenging task. And so measurement issues dog a lot of times what we see. And this came up repeatedly in also the discussions that are we really looking at the right numbers when we're talking about policy? How much faith can we have in the numbers? So that's one point, which is very good in the report, that really pinpoints what we should look at. I like the fact that the report highlights food support systems. It's not just food availability and what people are eating, but issues like livestock distribution that Misha showed us. Water, sanitation, and mortality rates. And I'm going to return to this in a second. Transportation, food safety issues, which forms a large part of the policy package at the end of the report, as well as touching upon women's labor force participation. The policy corner is very interesting. I like the fact it's broken up into processing. If you look at the policy corner, it's like broken up into production, processing, retail, transportation. So it's not like you're talking broadly about policies, but it's really granular in the sense you can look at only the transportation sector and see what needs to be done. So that was very, very interesting and nice to see. Two things jumped out from the report for me. One is the super low vegetable consumption in Nepal and Bangladesh. I was looking at the distribution of food consumption of the various types. But vegetable consumption, and we talk about micronutrient deficiency, but why is vegetable consumption so low in Bangladesh and Nepal? That was one thing that stood out. The second issue is the puzzle. The puzzle forms, the idea that why do we have undernutrition or malnutrition so widely prevalent in spite of food availability, particularly for a country like India? Food availability is not an issue. India is now a net food exporter. So why do we still have it? So one of the things, and this ties a little bit into my current research, that has to do with absorption rates. People might get the food they're eating, But both the quality of the food they're eating and the environment in which the food is processed, be it at home or in the shops, really matters. To give you an example, you can think about people cooking rice and vegetables. One of the most common things in South Asia, as well as Sub-Saharan Africa, is the use of biomass fuels for cooking, which is animal dung, forest wood, and crop waste. Right? These are the most polluting types of food. And there's now a very robust medical literature that says that there's a strong link between anemia and smoke inhalation from these biomass fuels. We'll get the numbers, it's staggering. And our own estimates in a very recent paper that we worked on, households that are cooking with biomass fuels, child mortality is exceptionally high. It's to the extent of 27 deaths per 1,000 live births in households that are using biomass fuels. So you might be eating food, but you're also inhaling smoke in the process of cooking. So it's a wash, right? Second is soil quality. One of the topics, Andrew touched upon a little bit. Soil doesn't have enough zinc or enough nutrients in them in most cases because of extensive cultivation or improper use of fertilizers or whatever it might be. So you might be eating fruits and vegetables, it doesn't have the required amount of nutrients that you think a tomato should have. And this brings us back to Jocelyn's study about like tracking the vitamin C component across from the field to the table. And you see the amount of loss that happens in the process. So that's one. So I think a large part of the puzzle has to do with trying to understand the environment. The sanitation, the water issues, toilets are being built in India but not used by people. Gastrointestinal diseases are rampant. So you're not going to absorb nutrients in these kind of settings. If you're inhaling smoke and you're repeatedly falling ill from impure water or lack of proper sanitation, that's not going to be super helpful. There's two things I want to highlight. One is it would be great to see more granular studies where we compare districts where, for instance, people are using cleaner fuels like LPG. There's a lot of LPG usage programs in India particularly. And districts where it's not, to see whether given the same food availability controlling for all the rest of the stuff, do we see a difference? Where the cooking fuel choice makes a difference in the malnutrition numbers or the prevalence of micronutrient deficiency, particularly anemia. Same thing with sanitation. Look at districts where there is a better piped water, better toilet usage versus district there are not, and see if there's a difference. Can you explain this puzzle by comparing district with good versus not so good availability of water, sanitation, cooking fuel choice, and so on and so forth. The second thing I want to really focus on are government programs, which Misha, I thought the report, for good reason, I think it's like a kind of worms, the PDS system, for instance. India has a public distribution system. So households can access staples, cereals, oils, sugar, so on and so forth, at discounted or sometimes free from ration shops, the government has. So the question is this. One of the emerging trends in India, if you travel through village India, you're going to find a huge prevalence of snack shops. Snacks are being sold and snacks are being consumed. So when you have PDS, households are getting some portion of the food free or at very reduced price. Where are they spending their disposable income? The income that they save from not buying rice or cereals, where is it going? Are they eating empty calories? Are they buying snacks, which is basically saturated fat, sugar, and salt, right? So you can see an improvement, an increase in malnutrition, even with food availability and good PDS systems, purely because of this unintended consequences that Misha touched on. Right? So there's the economics of the income effect of these systems. The second issue that I want to really highlight, which I hopefully, this is something you'll see in a future report, is a focus on the behavioral issues. So some of these things that we see, people falling ill more often than not, people eating the wrong kind of food, how much of it is just behavioral? People just don't wash hands as frequently as they should. So you could have information campaigns that has nothing to do with malnutrition, but simple things like how many times should you wash your hands. Teach that in school, for instance. And nowadays, you have these little YouTube videos that you can show in school about these little public health interventions that would make a big difference, right? So behavioral changes from don't eat so much snack or salts, particularly in a country where cardiovascular diseases are so high, particularly, and it's throughout South Asia, not just India. So that's something that's like worth thinking about. So I'm going to stop with that. I'm happy to answer some of the more, some of these issues that I raised during the discussion. But I do commend Misha for pulling off a really, really serious report. This is, as he said, lots of good research questions for graduate students and even for us. I can already see thinking about 2-3 very interesting research questions that can address this puzzle. In spite of food availability, why do we find obesity going up? Why do we find malnutrition persisting and so on? So thank you all.
Do we have more mics? Oh, it's just the one that's the one. No, just yeah. Okay. Can sit down. Yeah. No, I sit in the corner so I don't have to do like a tennis match. Looking my head. Thank you all. That was first of all a great introduction to the report, and also really good comments from all of you. So even though each of you had different disciplinary focus, you kind of touched on very similar issues, right? One issue that stands out for everyone is, do we have the data? Do we have the right data? Are we looking at the right things, etc.? And I think that's important. I agree with Ramya, there's lots of data, but it's all stuck somewhere. And the other thing is that if it's not government sanctioned data, it's not data, right? So you know that in India, the CMIE, what does CMIE stand for? Center for Monitoring of the Indian Economy. I got that. That's a private company that actually does a lot of very intense data collection, nationally representative data. And the other day I was talking to the people at FAO that produce the hunger numbers, which for a long time I've said are just nonsensical. And I told them that, the CMIE data shows very different trends from the data that they're using. And their response to me was, if it's not government data, the UN doesn't use it. So you're losing a lot of information because you make some value judgments on what is good data versus what's not good data, even though the quality may be good. So the question on how do you manage data, what's the minimum data set that we need, continues to be an important one. And I think from each of your points of view, it's useful to get a perspective on what kind of data investments are crucial as we look ahead. So, Ramya, I can't resist your classification of pre-swallowing and post-swallowing. I think that was amazing, right? It explains the real issues around the nutrition groups. And I hadn't thought about that up to now. And what's amazing is that the pre-swallowing and the post-swallowing people don't talk to each other. So we're talking about silos, but here you actually have silos within silos, which is quite an amazing issue to think through. And the other big issue I think that all of you touched on is the role of government policy. We seem to all know what the right answers are. we seem to all know that you can improve fertilizer use efficiency. You improve water use efficiency. You can get to better indoor air quality, better water, better sanitation, etc. But government policy sometimes acts as a big barrier, even though the government recognizes this is an issue. So Modi said, reduce nitrogen use by 25%, right? That's what you said. But they haven't reduced fertilizer subsidies. So you can't have it both ways. You can't say, I'm not going to change the incentives, but I want you to change. So there's a lot of quandary. I'm not sure I'm asking a question here. I'm just kind of blabbering. But any comments on any of the above?
Start the end. To that last issue, I think that we don't have enough policy and development programming that's infused with jargony, but theories of change, right? We're not testing our assumptions, we're not stating them, exposing them to scrutiny, and we're not translating them into effective development practice. So, who's responsible for that? How is that happening? I think that the general answer is not happening. And so we've got ambitions, and we've got policies that support innovation, and policies that support various components of change, but it's insufficient. So I think that we need more investment in that space, and that's also a way of ensuring that we get the collaborations that we need across the research and development continuum. That more organizations are thinking about things in the same way, being held to the same realities, and challenging ourselves to recognize, it's not enough just to say you must. It's how, and what are the sticky parts of the equation that need to change before good things will happen.
I'll just make a comment about the data. I think it's not just the investments in data, but it's also the capacity to use the data. I think that probably goes to and a lot of the resilience literature, at least like from Nepal earthquake and everything. What really was instrumental in policy change is having that high frequency data collection already in place. So I think that's a necessary prerequisite now, like just high frequency data collection.
So one interesting thing about this using government data is a recent example from India, where the Indian government didn't like reports coming out that the Indian government, the Modi government, for instance, after 2014, had this Swachh Bharat program where they were building toilets all over rural India. It was a great initiative, but the DFHS 2016 data was showing that it didn't have an impact. In fact, use of toilets were pretty low, and it literally was not statistically significant. So the Modi government actually stopped data collecting on the DFHS. If you read the bulletins, what they did was they said, we are not asking the right question, or not asking the question the right way. So we need to go back, revise the questions on sanitation before we start gathering data again. So this is one of the pitfalls of using government data, that if the data shows that whatever the government's priorities are not working out, the government itself would somehow change the question. So you're going to get what the government wants you to get. That's the bottom line, right? So that's the first part. The second is, you mentioned the Nepal earthquake, but all these South Asian countries, there have been massive floods in Pakistan, a huge foreign exchange debt crisis in Sri Lanka. So there are all these things that are going on, which not only turns back any gains, it takes 10 years to see any improvement in the numbers, be it malnutrition or data collection, whatever angle you might want to look at. And then within 3 months, it's entirely reversed. So it's like a non-stop struggle to kind of maintain this upward trend. The last part that I do want to mention is that there are some changes happening already at the field setting, and this is not to do with the government data. For instance, we know with nutrition, one of the big challenges is this recall method. You ask them, what did you eat 7 days before? I could barely remember what I ate yesterday for lunch, much less go back 7 days for the entire household to categorize how much eggs and how much meat and how much vegetables, right? So one way people are overcoming that thing is mobile phones. So you don't actually ask them, what did you do the last week? You actually randomly call them during the day and say, okay, today, what did you eat? And you try to find a systematic pattern that if I call people every Monday at 4 p.m., do I get a consistent answer, right? So this is becoming kind of the new frontier in terms of data collection when it comes to particularly food consumption for that. So there are changes afoot, so hopefully all for better.
Actually, there is a question on Zoom on use of digital tools in India, and it refers to mitigation strategy. I suspect greenhouse gas mitigation strategy, use of digital tools in that sense. So now that Arnab already raised this issue of using technology to solve some issues, and I guess that was the question for you. What's your take on use of digital tools for mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions in India?
Well, I mean, the credibility in the carbon markets in India is not high, which keeps the price of carbon quite low, which means that we're not really changing many practices now, based on the current setup. So the more credibility that we can add to the system, so not just practice change, but what it actually means in different production contexts, the better. There are things that we need to be paying attention to, proxies, particularly from Earth observation, that can be particularly useful. And some of these satellite platforms are just coming online with the radar data, for example, with the NISAR mission. It's a joint Indian NASA mission. And when we have that in place, then there's things that we can say about field hydrology that we can't say at scale now, and we can do it very efficiently. So capitalizing on Earth observation. There's also, I think, a lot to be done, and this I think relates to your comments about essentially crowdsourcing, right? Of having ICT be part of that mix, even if the data are imperfect. But whether it's image acquisition, so go to your field, take a picture, and then having an AI-based solution tell us what's going on in the field. I think there's a lot of scope for that. I think the only note of caution is that I think we have to calibrate the kinds of data that we collect, so we're not just collecting data for data's sake, and it becomes an overwhelming exercise. So figuring out what the lean data approaches are, what do we really need to know outside of Sentinel sites is also probably part of the equation.
I'll just quickly add on the data collection. I think it's fantastic. People have figured out how to do it. It is going to be a bit more efficient and cost efficient. But the issue is, we did this analysis looking at all the COVID studies, the sampling frame they use, how the sampling methodology, the data inclusionness. So at each stage, they are leading out the worst affected by food insecurity. So either who picks up the phone, who has access to phone, what kind of sampling frame, especially if it's nested in an existing study. So each layer of the sampling frame, you're reducing. There was an overall bias between getting those really food insecure people. So when you look at difference between someone whatever rural urban, you're not getting the most bottomest. So you're adding bias to it. So I think the digital tools are great, but also understanding where the sort of again, the way we sample and inclusive design, where it sneaks in is very good to keep in mind. And I think those standards exist actually, even before COVID happened, there were standards on how to do inclusive sampling design. So.
One additional issue around data is some interesting work happening at Agrosat in Hyderabad. Is a lot of the district statistics on land area, under cultivation, irrigation, water use, etc. There are lots of data gaps, right? So that a few districts in Maharashtra haven't reported any area under cultivation this year. So what Agrosat has done is to use satellite imagery to fill in those data gaps. And that's become a really useful tool now to be able to say, okay, we know that there are gaps because of reporting issues or whatever. And so with satellite imagery and remote sensing, you can actually come in and recreate that. But it's also a way to cross-check some of the government data. And so what ICROSAT is doing now is making that public access, showing that, our estimates using remote sensing are these. And putting that out as parallel to the official statistics. So that's another way to use modern digital tools also. Are there any other questions on the website, on the Zoom?
There was only one on why the emissions in Bangladesh are high, and I think that refers to my slides. I wasn't trying to, is it high or is it low? I just wanted to point at how looking at the same numbers from the different angles can give you two completely different stories. So it's not, is it high or is it low? And again, relative to what, high or low. So, but there are no other questions right here.
Yeah, add a little bit to that. It's kind of, I feel, it's a little unfair for smaller countries that are like kind of grow only one crop, primarily like Bangladesh. So the relevant comparison would be the amount of emission that happens in Bangladesh versus that happens in West Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, right? Because when you compare with India, India is much more diversified. It's just a space and the soil quality that allows you to do different things. Bangladesh is a Gangetic plains, and there's literally ideal for growing rice, and that's sustainable. And naturally, you're going to have much more methane emission just for the country and that one crop than you're going to see for India as well. Right? So this comparison about whether emissions are greater for Bangladesh or not is a bit unfair because it's a small country that grows one crop, right? So it's going to be high. So what you put on the denominator really matters. So if you want to compare Bangladesh, you better compare it with just West Bengal and Bihar.
That's
a fair point. Yeah. And then you'll see a different picture.
Yeah. Let's see. Let me open up. Let's see if David. I think I'm supposed to
use that or not?
I'm not sure, but I'm happy to walk around.
Well, no, I had it's an excellent report, and I look forward to reading it. All I know about it is what you all presented. But I had a question for Andy, which was, you showed some really interesting results regarding the incidence of the subsidy or the potential changes in incidence of the subsidy. So I was wondering, though, it looked like from the data that I just quickly looked at here, a couple of the tables, that nitrogen management is really a small part of the story in terms of agricultural-based emissions. It looks like in terra fermentation, rice cultivation. Can't remember what the third one was. There are three others that seem to dominate that considerably. So I was just wondering, where do you see getting the biggest bang for the buck in terms of policy change, in addition to the story you told on nitrogen?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I would just say that the baselines are also imperfect, because as Misha points out in the report, a lot of these, the baselines are based on tier 1 equations that aren't robust. So with a tier 1 equation, the emissions of methane are 1-to-1 with rice acreage, right? Because the nuance of the differences in the hydrology, the organics management are not there. I would say on the nitrogen side, the jury's still out. But if you think about what we can change and where there's an incentive from, like in India, from a budgetary perspective, the Indian government, I think in 2022 spent $22 billion on urea subsidy. So there's an aligned agenda around reducing subsidy cost in India. And if you look at both the direct and the indirect costs associated with the nitrogen fertilizer, it's significant in terms of the energetics going in and the carbon emissions associated with that, and the N2O. The N2O story is not as clean. It's not the same magnitude as the methane piece, but there's a lot of uncertainty in the methane numbers. There's also a lot of uncertainty about how to manage water. In a lot of the areas that are the strongest sources of methane, farmers can't drain those fields. They're not flooded because they're irrigated. They're flooded because where they are in the landscape. They're flooded because they're in the eastern Ganges. Those rice areas are where they are for a reason. Some of that can't be controlled economically. Or if you wanted to pump that water, that would come with its own emissions. So yes, methane is a big priority, but in terms of things that we have leverage to change in the very near term at scale, with better policy, with better incentives in place, I think nitrogen is still compelling. Thanks.
Who's next?
Do you think we should be worried about greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture?
That's a leading question.
I think we don't have the luxury to ignore greenhouse gases from any sector, but I think we need to be very realistic about what we can address and what we can't. And to make sure that we have a cross-sectoral approach to policy setting based on where we think that we have the most leverage. But there's got to be better numbers in place. We have to be more realistic about matching the problem diagnostics with the solution diagnostics and then take it from there.
You're right, but I think if you look at the NASA and all the new satellite data that's coming out, some of it is just on CO2, for example, is not really understandable, explainable, and flies against lots of our current ideas. But for methane, it's really great. And I'm not sure, I don't think we'll get to methane from rice paddies. We'll be getting to methane leaks from oil wells and drilling operations. And that's where we should put the effort.
Good point sources, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but where there's an alignment, whether that is, in the winter cycle, Boro in Bangladesh, are there farmers that are continuously flooding, or they're managing organic matter in a way that could be easily modified? I mean, I think we have to understand the problems more systematically and target those areas that really seem to be making a disproportionate contribution.
It would seem like methane from animals is where you should focus for two reasons. One, it's relatively easy to reduce it by even fertilizing your rice straw with urea before you feed it to animals, but also because it increases productivity. Sort of win-win.
So one of the projects that we're working on together with Andy is called Zero Hunger, Zero Carbon, where we're trying to see what are the opportunities for reducing greenhouse gas emissions while at the same time not sacrificing on productivity. And in that project, I think the two big opportunities are one on rice cultivation, but primarily dry season rice cultivation rather than wet season because of the issues that Andy brought up earlier. Nitrogen use is the other one. But livestock, especially buffaloes and cattle, and management of for livestock, management of herd sizes, etc., and the sex composition of the herd. These are big opportunities, I think, as we go at this. So that's an area we've been very much engaged in. And one of the issues now is donors decide what you work on. So most of the donor money is in climate mitigation. So how do you take the climate mitigation money and use it for what you need to do? So that's where zero hunger, zero carbon comes in. So go ahead,
A
Mike.
quick question related to the slide.
If you can go speak
I'm
loudly.
a junior Humphrey Fellow. I'm interested in the slide, especially the first or second one about investment in agriculture sector in India. It's about 10 billion, right?
10 million?
Or yeah, and 1 billion.
That's one state.
1 billion in one state.
Then my question is, what specific investments were they, and what do you think about the effective investment.
Yeah,
Yeah, please.
What was the question?
What areas the investment go?
so that Orissa 1 billion investment, what was it on, would you know?
And how effective
Prabhu
do you think?
knows more than I. I mean, I would say that that's part of the issue, is that a lot of the money is not catalytic. It's not thinking about investing in systems that will be self-sustaining and sort of, draw in more private sector investment, for example. So on the mechanization side, it's not about supporting value chains, it's about supporting procurement of machinery. So without being too broad about it, I think that the returns are not maybe what they could be. Probably you want to address that more completely.
So I had breakfast with the Agriculture Secretary of Orissa just last month and asked him the same question you asked. And he was saying that a large part of that money went for promoting millet production and diversification out of rice. Part of the money went for livestock, small ruminant production, goats, moles, chicken, etc. And then part of the money went for post-harvest processing and connecting it to the value chain. So those were sort of the big areas that he was focused on. And given that he was focused, I assumed that the money was also connected to what he was focused on. That's a good question. Raghav, you're very quiet.
I do have questions. I just wanted to give other people a chance. I thought what was very interesting was the anemia graph, the one for each state. Because again, this is trying to give an example of how reading the report changed my opinion on something, which was I always assumed India was not doing well with women's anemia because it's a vegetarian country and maybe that's the main story. And then when you see Pakistan and India, they both don't do it. So I'm guessing it's like a women empowerment or gender story.
It's a global story.
Yeah, but it's only these two countries. The other countries have got their levels have come down considerably.
It's a global story, but I don't know to what extent demographics plays a role. That's why I want to see. And there's also all these things where women stop eating meat after they're 30 or 40. To what extent, they might be eating and then they stop. To what extent? Anemia tends to be sort of a global issue. Everybody has it. And it could be inflammation pathway related, nothing to do with uptake. Yeah.
I just thought it was, when you see those graphs together, there's a clear drop in all the countries. But for India and Pakistan, it's kind of straight. It's there's no.
No, I'm glad it shocked you because that was the whole idea that if everybody who's reading a report finds something shocking, I think I feel that's a big success, I think. And also if you find something that you can relate your research to and you haven't been thinking that way, oh wait, I can use this for my research actually because I can use in my area, then that's even better, honestly. So that's one of the goals of the report.
Another question.
Can I add something to this,
Sure.
Raghav? So this is a well-known fact. That's why I brought up the cook and fill choice thing. That smoke inhalation prevents iron absorption. There's a very high link. So if women are actually cooking with biomass fuel, and you can see the amount of smoke, if you have gone to any house that has this mud ovens where you stick in firewood and try to cook, the amount of smoke that they inhale on a regular basis, 2-3 times a day. So that's why I brought up this idea that if you look at households that are cooking and look at prevalence of anemia across those households, right, and control for the food intake and everything else, you will see a significant relationship.
But I would imagine, at least in this particular case, to kind of rule out this explanation, is that in Nepal, people use firewood to burn, so chula. So I guess that potentially.
then you run into, is the data right?
Of course.
I mean,
But-
the
But the
chicken
question was,
data.
how did you present it? Was it percentage of the
Percentage of women,
prevalence is
Among-
basically percentage, right?
Percentage of women in certain age group.
So there's a,
So absolute numbers, yeah, I see. Okay.
and it's kind of like straight for Pakistan and India. For Nepal, there's a huge drop. For everyone, there's a drop other than.
I think one way to look at that is, many of these countries have the same DHS data.
Hmm.
And so if you look at the DHS data, you may see a much more accurate representation compared to the sort of national statistics data. But I'm not sure. I haven't looked at it.
Not to make one more point.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say
Oh,
this,
sure, yeah.
this comes back to the pre-swallowing and post-swallowing. Right, so the idea that part of the anemia story is whether you have the right food,
Yeah.
but then whether you can absorb that food or not. Sorry.
I think Professor Basu mentioned this, that it's a future, mission no stress to you, but a future report could actually compare Tamil Nadu and Sri Lanka, West Bengal and Bangladesh. I think that would be more sort of interesting and not use India as a whole. But that also kind of answers, I remember you focused on the Sri Lanka egg number. To me, that sounded okay because I thought Sri Lanka would have a higher number of egg consumption. Because I don't know, I feel like it's, I think of it as Tamil Nadu or Kerala as opposed to as.
But historically though, from 1961, they have a high consumption. I mean, there was, it was in 1961 to, it was, even historically, that.
Oh, it's always been high.
But the thing is the number of kgs per animal per year. That's how they're
Right.
calculating the.
Okay.
So it's like hens are laying 14 kgs worth of, each hen is laying 14 kgs worth of egg in a year.
Oh, I thought it was the number of eggs consumed.
No,
What's the number of eggs
laying.
produced?
So it's basically higher productive chicken.
So.
Oh, wow,
super
6
chicken.
versus 4.
So they have super chickens.
Strange.
Okay, that makes sense.
High-yielding chicken.
No, but the key point over here is, in this context, because the number is so off the chart, and so you're right, I mean, it just jumps out, it's like a lot of. What is the average egg production for, the high-end chickens in the US, for example? Right, so, you could basically say that Sri Lanka somehow infused their chickens with US stock at some point. So they have a different breed. It's like what India did with milk production. You got the cows from the US and that massively increased milk production. Right? So we don't know the genetics of these animals and where they're coming from. So it could well be that Sri Lanka at some point had a poultry program where they got the high laying hens from the US. And that's what you're seeing the effect compared to India, which is still and Indian chickens are not like very good looking. So I don't expect them to lay a lot of eggs. So,
I mean, the other surprising thing was the urbanization rates in Sri Lanka, which
Oh,
seemed
yeah.
tiny. But part of the problem could also be how urbanization is defined. Right, it's the same issue in India. I think in India also you underestimate urbanization by the way you define it. And it'd be interesting to compare the definitions across countries. Any other question? Yeah. Go ahead. I don't
I
know
am
your name. so-
Abdullah from Pakistan. So thank you so much for the interesting panel talk and presentation as well. There's so many topics, as you mentioned, there's so many research questions, but one thing that stood out for me was the need for collaboration, especially about political will. And my question is basically, because it's encouraging that you're expanding it to whole of South Asia and expanding out of India, which is good. But considering that you have the platform to collect data, to gather data from all these places, from Pakistan and India specifically, my question relates to that. The problem of smog, there needs to be a solution from both of those countries to basically solve that problem. Do you plan on using your platform? Because we know that there are channels and there are platforms. There is a water crisis, but there are channels that solve that. there's been 3 wars, but the Indus Water Treaty has stood by. So do you plan on working towards creating a platform or a forum that can solve that issue? Because that is one of the biggest issues.
What's the issue? I didn't get-
Smog,
Crop
yes.
burning.
Crop
Crop burning, smog, yes.
So what we're doing, we are providing evidence, findings, and actually with our colleague, I mean, he's now not with TCI anymore, but Ali, maybe you know him. So we wrote a blog on, we were doing Punjab. So looking into different nutritional outcomes in 2 Punjabs and trying to point in how similar some things are. And then, and when it comes to pollution, it's pretty much the same thing. So which is even more fluid across borders. So what we plan to do is when we plan to, and that's in the pipeline, we plan to do food agriculture nutrition fan Pakistan, fan Bangladesh, fan Sri Lanka, and then to go to those countries, to talk to people, to talk to stakeholders, and to present our evidence. And then what is going to happen? Too early to say, but these reports are in the pipeline. So this is what we can do, right? So we can come up with some findings, some conclusions, some recommendations, but then what ultimately local governments are going to do, it's up to them. But it's a very good point.
Actually, in my experience, there's a lot more collaboration among the countries than is seen in the media. So like Andy knows that for many decades, there was this very vibrant project called the Rice Wheat Consortium for South Asia, which covered all of the countries in the Indo-Gangetic Plain looking at rice wheat. And, you know, Indian scientists, Pakistani scientists, Nepal, Bangladesh, all worked together as part of this consortium and visited each other. And, you know, I've been to Pakistan 3 times. And I traveled at that time with an Indian passport 3 times into Pakistan, and it was quite an amazing. And we drove all the way up to the Pakistan, Punjab, up to the Indian border, and then did the same thing from the Indian side up to and looked at Punjab from both sides and trying to understand the issues around soil salinity, soil fertility, and all of that. And that was quite an experience. And that is still continuing, and is it some way?
Ways and means, not, and Dr. Perota still does, there's other regional mechanisms, TAS and whatnot, that also do that, and there's this SARC, and the SARC Agricultural Center. So there are those mechanisms, they're probably maybe not as vibrant as they should be, but there's opportunity there.
Right. And I think from our side, as an academic institution, we provide the data and evidence, and then others will have to carry it forward.
So thank you for this wonderful report. It's more like a suggestion. It's more like a thing which I'm thinking, and you might correct me if it's not right. But can we include something like seeing agriculture from the agroclimatic perspective, and then linking with production if we can? Although you have included the district-wise, the major crops, the major crop districts are growing in this region, but can you include or see from the 15 agroclimatic region, which is very prominent in India? And when it comes to diet, can we look from the perspective the local food habits or the regional food habits while understanding the food habits in totality? Will it help to have a more holistic understanding or regional perspective by understanding the global south perspective?
So for the agroclimatic zones, I think that for South Asia region, it would be quite complicated because there are so many of those. We are working in Bihar alone, you have 4. Right, so on South Asia level, I'm not sure how, I mean, I see what you mean, trying to connect the zones with other things, but that would be probably a good exercise for country reports. It's a Bangladesh report, or Pakistan report, but for South Asia report, it would be, I cannot even imagine what that map would look like, and the sage would probably kill me if I tried to ask something like that. Your other question was on prevalent diets. And that was the idea, actually. It was the idea to run a survey among students. What's the typical, breakfast, lunch, or dinner, work days versus weekend, holiday versus regular, etc., etc. So we had some discussion, but then again, we were just discussing only within India. Can you imagine people agreeing on what is the typical, or not even agreeing, but getting where you have such a diverse diet that I was lucky to experience that it's beyond even, I couldn't even imagine. So again, a very good point, and this is what I was thinking about to include. I thought that would be quite exotic and interesting, but then that's almost a whole separate project and study. But it's spot on, yeah.
Misha, this last trip, I was in 6 states, all the way from Chhattisgarh to Maharashtra and Telangana. Every single, and in rural India, every single little hotel I stayed in, morning breakfast was dosa. So there is some homogeneity coming up among the people. But I see 2 questions here on the chat. There's one question from Sarita. I'm going to read both and then you guys can pick up what you want. A question from Sarita from Ahmedabad, and she's asking, is nutritional security more important than food security and sovereignty for any developing nation? I guess food sovereignty issues. And the other is from Shashir Kumar. Is there any specific information on impact of use of fertilizers and pesticides on nutritional status when there is a rush to increase productivity? How far can organic farming progress in India and Orissa, I guess? Yes, India. So, anybody wants to respond? Nutritional food sovereignty.
Sure. I mean, I don't know what food sovereignty means, like in that case, because it's one of those things that has 7 different definitions. I mean, one of the things that became evident, and I haven't highlighted here, like how food systems and social systems, what is food sovereignty about? Is it about food justice, or is it about self-sufficiency, or is it about resilience? And I think then when like, for example, like when after the Ukraine war, like people talk about, the African nations talk about food sovereignty, but that's very much about self-sufficiency and resilience. But then when you hear like local movements, it's very much about food justice and wanting to have agency in their food environment, not corporate control. So I really struggle with like what the definition is, so to contextualize. But I mean, there is a movement towards not food, but more focusing on nutrition security. There was this phrase, actually I heard it from FAO, from David Laborde, like solving hunger nutritiously, which is a big paradigm shift in my book. But it's not just like giving hungry people calories. It's about like making the transition to like, you don't, because then you're not dealing with obesity and poor diets, which I thought was a pretty heavy lift in terms of investment, but also in terms of behaviors and access as well.
Going from calories to balanced diets.
Yeah. And you're going from like hungry to basically balanced diets, which is a substantial big move.
Yes.
So if I can add just a sentence to this is, if you look at from the perspective of governments, say the Indian government, clearly food security is more important than nutrition security, because the way the PDS system is designed is that you want people to just have the calories. So you're giving them cereal, soil, salt, but you're not giving them carrots, you're not giving them stuff that actually has high nutritional value, right? So it's the issue is more food security, and that's where the focus is, and not nutrition security. And the other question about organic agriculture, pesticide and fertilizers, It's very low uptake in developing, particularly in India. You know, I think only a very niche population actually cares about organic food or what they're eating. Read labels in supermarkets. Most of the people just buy stuff in open markets, and it's just stuff. They don't really ask, you know, did you use pesticide or did you not? So I think that organic movement is really far, far away in India.
Yeah, but there is a political / civil movement around what's known as natural farming and zero budget natural farming that's becoming very vocal, if not as much area on the ground. And that's something one needs to watch and see how that happens over time.
It's happening with cash crops more.
It's
Coffee,
definitely-
cashews. coffee.
Definitely with cash
whatnot.
crops, but also now, there's, like Andhra Pradesh has quite some area under this system. There's a whole political movement behind that, but something that I don't think many of us know enough about. But this idea of food security, nutrition security is basically going from addressing hunger to balanced diets. And historically, we've always done food policy around hunger reduction. And it's been hard for governments to get away from that, to think more broadly about nutrition.
Prabhu, can I ask you, for the millet's example in addition, do we have any early evidence about changes in nutritional outcomes that have been associated with that?
A long time. It's too early, but what they're trying to do is put that also into the procurement system rather than look at that.
So Odisha, I was quite surprised that Odisha's spent so much. They're really good with their millet mission. They've actually bottom up. They've done really well on it, but it's not included in the PDS.
So it's not in.
In Odisha, they've put it in the the ICDS, so the supplementary feeding. But there are other states that have started including millets in the PDS. It's a very small fraction, but it's happening. Like I think there are 5 states that do it now. Only one state does it at a big scale in Karnataka. So out of 5 kgs that you get every month, 2 kgs is ragi. So that's quite a bit.
I mean, Chhattisgarh is doing very well also from a PDS point. Not so much
Doing well with
millets.
the PDS, but not.
So on PDS, I would advertise our latest book that has just come out on social safety nets in India. With Andali Brahman and myself, and just came out a couple of months ago. Also available as free as an ebook. You can download it. Therefore, no excuse not to download it. And it has a whole chapter on PDS and PDS reform, along with the midday meal, it's the ICDS, the employment guarantee scheme, life insurance, health insurance, etc. So it's really worth reading. So please download that too. I think with that, I'm not seeing any more questions here or in the room. So wait, someone's saying something about organic farming. So yeah, I think that there was an endorsement of your comment that organic products are not affordable yet. So with that, let's thank Misha for a wonderful report and the panelists for a great discussion.